This week on the Communicators, a discussion with the outgoing chairman of the FCC, Kevin Martin. This program was taped on January 13, 2009. On January 15th, Kevin Martin announced his intention to resign from the FCC and join the Aspen Institute.
FCC Chairman Kevin Martin, if you were a betting man, will the February 17th transition to digital television be moved?
I think it's probably 50-50, Peter.
And what would be the effect if it were moved?
Well, let me say first, I think it is critical that we take some kind of action to fix the coupon program. I mean, I think that the government needs to find a way to address the fact that they currently have a shortage of revenue and that they can't issue any more coupons. You know, we've been promising people for more than a year that to ease the burden on switching from analog to digital, that they're going to be able to get up to 2 coupons worth $40, which is a significant amount of the price of a converter box. And you know, we've all been traveling the country telling everyone and promising them that we would help them ease this burden. And Congressman Markey had written me in the fall and had asked me to do an estimate of whether I thought there was enough revenue, and I had actually said I was concerned there wasn't enough money in the coupon program to meet the demand. So I definitely think that we've got to get that fixed. And in order for us to go forward, we first have to make sure that those coupons are flowing again. And I think we could actually probably take the opportunity to fix some other aspects of the coupon program.
Such as?
Well, you know, one of the biggest complaints I hear when we're going around the country doing the DTV forums is that the fact that the coupons expire after only 90 days. Many people don't get them. They're, get lost in the mail, or they get them and they don't have time to focus on it yet, and the next thing you know, the 90 days has already expired. And I really think that we could enable people to be able to have some more time. We could also enable them to be reissued. People that have said that they've either lost their coupons, they never received them. If they're on the mailing list as someone who was mailed the coupons, and they can't get another one. So I think you could fix some aspects of that. And the major concern with some of those restrictions was because there was limited resources to make sure it was fair. But if they're going to put more resources into it, they could eliminate some of those burdens and make this a much more consumer-friendly program. I think they could do that relatively quickly, and I think if they did, and we got people in the converter box coupons in their hands, they could still have time to go purchase those converter boxes and be set up and prepared for the February 17th deadline. Now, obviously, this is going to be up to the Congress on whether to end up moving the date. Congress is the one who picked February 17th. You know, I'm not actually even sure that if it was up to the Commission, we would have picked February 17th. It is in the middle of the winter, which will impact some people who might have to make an adjustment to their antenna, and certainly it makes it more difficult for the broadcasters who are making some changes. But now that you have that date, I am concerned that if we start moving it around, and even the discussion of moving around is creating some additional consumer confusion. You know, the industry and the Commission and NTIA have spent a lot of time and effort educating people about the February 17th date. Indeed, you know, the most recent surveys showed that in December there was already a 95% awareness of February 17th deadline. So I am concerned about the creation for consumer confusion, but I think the first priority has to be to fix the coupon program.
Do you agree with a lot of congressional Democrats and the Obama transition team that the coupon converter program has not been well managed by the Bush administration?
Well, you know, I think that it was well managed for its resources. I do think that it was foreseeable that we were going to run out of revenue, out of money for the program. I mean, like I said, I had written to Congress in the fall. I know that was in contrast to what NTIA had said. NTIA had said they thought they would have enough money. And candidly, I had written and said that I didn't think so. If you based it on the overall demand that we anticipated from Nielsen numbers, and even more importantly, if you based it on the demand that we saw in Wilmington, we did the early test and turnover in Wilmington. If you base it on the demand that we were seeing there wasn't going to be enough resources to ensure that everyone who wanted a coupon would be able to get it. So you know, I do think that was something that I'd encourage Congress to put more revenue into it. I'd asked everyone to relook at that because that was my assessment as well.
Well, who would be most affected if it is delayed?
Well, I think the most important aspect of all of this is how it affects viewers and consumers and real people, and I think that there has to be a trade-off between making sure we're not creating any additional consumer confusion, but at the same time fixing the coupon programs so that people can get access to them. I mean, if there is a way to fix that, solve some of these other problems, and get that program flowing with revenue again so that people can be going out and buying converter boxes, I think that's preferable. But I do recognize that's an essential part of this transition. It's an essential part of easing people's burdens, and indeed it's what we've been promising everyone throughout the country.
Representative Joe Barton has said that millions of dollars will be wasted if the date is moved. Are there costs associated with moving the date?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think there are significant costs, in terms of all of the educational material and educational efforts that have gone around to educating people about the February 17th date. There could be some other technical costs. I mean, we have some contracts that we're in the process of putting in place for call centers and some advertising that we've placed. So I think mainly what he was referring to is the amount of money that's been spent on trying to educate people about that date already.
Well, you have one remaining FCC meeting that you are chairing, and one of the items on the agenda is to extend the analog signal for 30 days. Is this kind of a way of answering this potential problem?
No, it's really trying to focus on another issue, Peter. One of the things that we implemented in Wilmington because we got them to do a test market early, and Commissioner Copps actually deserves a lot of credit for coming up with the idea of trying to make sure we found a market that was willing to go and transition early to be able to determine what were some of the pluses and minuses and some of the challenges so we could adjust going forward. And so in that context, when in Wilmington in September when they transitioned, we had the broadcasters keep an analog signal up temporarily. And it didn't put on any programming, but it did put on a message that said if you're watching this screen, then you haven't made the transition to digital successfully, and you can call this number. And it listed our number, and it listed a specific toll-free number, so we could keep track of the number of calls that we received. And we found that was very useful in terms of trying to help educate people, and it provided another platform that anybody who hadn't made the transition would be turning on their television, that's what they would be receiving. And I think that was the impetus for that legislation, and I think that it actually is a good idea to temporarily allow for people to be able to see a message about what to do and where to go to get further information. And so I think it's really addressing a different issue, but I think it is an important piece of legislation. And it's certainly something we supported, and it's something that I think is a good idea, and I'm pleased that Congress passed it, and I'm glad that we'll be able to implement it this week.
Well, when the transition does occur, what's the FCC's plan of action? Is there a central command? Do you have phone banks scattered throughout the U.S.? What's the plan?
Well, we've done two things in regards to phone banks, and we certainly saw a large number of people call when we did the early transition test in Wilmington, and we've been doing soft tests periodically throughout the country, and in particular regions. And so we've tried to be prepared for the call volume that could end up coming. We've increased already and maximized our call center. So we've hired the maximum number of people that we can have for that, contracted for the maximum number of people. We've bought additional equipment, so it's maxed out. In addition to that, we've put out a request for proposal for a contractor to come in and be able to supplement that with several thousand contractors to be able to help us hire. To have several thousand contractors to help us handle all the calls that'll be coming in, and we anticipate that we'll be able to hire several thousand contractors with that. We've taken, Congress gave us about $20 million to handle the call centers and to handle consumer education, and we're going to spend about half of it, somewhere between $7 and $10 million on this contract for outsourcing a call center support. Now, I don't think that alone could handle all the calls, but the industry has some significant call center plans as well. The broadcasters have been working with the major networks, who have also been working with the cable operators and the local state broadcasters. I, along with some representatives from the Obama transition team, actually had a joint meeting with all of them and said that they needed to come up with one comprehensive plan for how to handle their call center, as opposed to having 4 or 5 different numbers that consumers could call, and that there should be a way to make sure that all of their plans were integrated, and that calls could easily be transferred back and forth between the different potential avenues, and that was an important part of our contracting process as well. We said that someone needed to demonstrate they had handled significant volume and be able to demonstrate that they could integrate in with other call centers. And so I think with the industry's help, I think that will be sufficient to end up handling the volume of calls. And I think it's very similar in that sense to the educational efforts. I don't think we could have done it by ourselves, but certainly with all the efforts that have been put in by the industry, I think we've been successfully able to make sure that people are aware of this upcoming transition.
What's the FCC's budget?
Overall, or on DTV?
Overall.
Oh, overall, we have, it's about a $300 million budget that the Commission has. Now, that doesn't include, obviously the auction revenues. The money that we generate from auctions actually goes into the U.S. Treasury, and we are able to keep a small percentage of some of those revenues for some of the administrative costs of running the auction, but it's a very small percentage. But we receive about $300 million. It's around a $300 million budget.
Is it enough?
Oh, for the commission?
Yeah.
Oh, I think so. I mean, I think around that amount. I mean, we've had, some increases, but most of the increases actually, even in the time I've been chairman, have been, normal increases through the cost of living adjustments for personnel, already scheduled in increases in our rent. But generally, I think that it's a sufficient amount. I mean, I think that the two components that aren't included in that budget that are both the Universal Service Administration, which is done through USAC, and as I said, some of the auction revenues and a component of our auction processes. But if we were going to take on, there have been some proposals that have the commission taking on more of a direct role in universal service in both the administration of it and in the providing for the resources to the industry. And I think if we were going to take on that burden, we would need to have some additional resources because USAC does do a lot of the processing of those grants and applications.
How involved has the White House been, the Bush White House been in FCC matters?
You know, the administration has weighed in on occasion. So, most of the time, I think that we work together closely and work together with people in Congress. And occasionally, they've weighed in on things against what I wanted to do. I had a free broadband proposal that I thought we should include as a condition on an auction, and they actually weighed in against. But generally speaking, I think that the administration has done their best to appoint people that they trusted to run the agencies, and they've tried to let the people execute on those policies and make sure that the people that were there had the same basic beliefs in a free market system in which the competition in the industry would lead to consumer benefits in terms of lower prices and increased choice, and then allowing people who had more of an expertise in it to run those areas.
So your broadband proposal is dead in the water at this point?
Well, it's still in circulation before the commissioners, and we're taping earlier in the week, so I can, if anyone still want to, hopefully they'll have voted it by the time this would, play. But I think that the commissioners have indicated that they don't really want to move forward with it right now. I think that's, I find it particularly ironic, only because several of the commissioners had called on us to actually do this. Indeed, when we started the notice of proposed rulemaking on the process, some of them were critical we hadn't already done it, and then insisted we put a date in the item by which the commission would have to act. Of course, whenever the commission puts its own deadline in there, it doesn't mean that they have to actually do it, as this instance, because that date came and went in August, and the commission just never acted. I've put several different versions of the item on the floor trying to address concerns that were raised, both in terms of interference and in terms of concerns that were raised about whether or not the broadband proposal would include a provision that restricted content for minors that were utilizing the free broadband component, which I've already taken out. And so the only thing that's in there now is trying to put in place something that's very conservative in terms of its potential interference with its neighbors. And that has a free broadband condition that you have to reserve 25% of your capacity to offer a free, lifeline broadband service. And I think that's an important component of making sure that everyone in the country, including people with low income, can have access to broadband capability. And so, I've been very disappointed the other commissioners weren't willing to move forward.
But it looks like you may have an ally in President-elect Obama.
With I always take any allies I can get anywhere, and so certainly I hope that ultimately whether it's done this week or next week or next month, that the commission does adopt it, because I think it's the right approach, and I think it's an important part of making sure everyone has access to get hooked up.
Well, we're talking with Kevin Martin here on the Communicators. He's outgoing chairman of the FCC, chairman for another week or so?
For about another week, exactly.
And are you planning on resigning at a particular time?
I don't have any plans to announce.
And speaking of President-elect Obama, one of the things he recently said was that he wants to update an outdated reform regulatory system. Do you think that the FCC regulatory model is broken?
I certainly think that the approach that was embodied in the original 1934 Act and the 1996 Telecommunications Act that regulated based upon the platform or the technology as opposed to the service has made it much more difficult, and has made it more difficult for us to create level playing fields. Now, I think that the Commission, since over the last few years, has done an important and a tremendous job of trying to create a level playing field by focusing more on consistent regulatory approaches when the services offered are being offered the same by the different industries. And I think that's been one of our an important goal of ours, to make sure we create a fair environment and a level playing field for people to go compete. And I think we've been able to achieve that with a lot of rule changes that we've made. But I do think that the underlying act, which is still focused on a silo-based regulation of old by technology, is outdated. And I think if Congress were to adopt a new act, I think that would be helpful and give the Commission some additional tools and a different approach.
Well, additional tools, does that mean more regulation of the internet, more regulation of other markets? Or other technologies?
I don't think so. I think it's more actually just helping clarify that we should be having a consistent approach when the same kinds of services are being offered by different platforms. They should be treated from the same way. And helping clarify that could help clarify some of the litigation that will always go on in the implementation of those regulations by the Commission.
For example, if NBC is broadcasting over the internet, that should be regulated as well as their television content?
No, I mean, what I was actually thinking more of when you're talking about the different platforms delivering the same kind of service. So when a cable company or a wireless company or a telephone company are delivering broadband, and that broadband is competing with the different platforms from the consumer perspective, then that should be treated similarly. Now, the history of broadcast regulation has been different because the broadcasters are using something that belongs to the public. Part of the reason why broadcasters, both radio and television, are treated uniquely is that they have access to a public resource that they had largely been originally given in exchange for making sure that they fulfill certain public interest obligations. And those public interest obligations, went to making sure that they put on a certain amount of local news and local content, that they were serving their local community, that they didn't put on programming that was inappropriate for children during hours when children were likely to be watching, that they closed captioned their programming that they put on, they could participate in the emergency alert system. All of those were public interest obligations with the idea being that they would agree to comply and provide those as an important public service in exchange for getting that input, that spectrum for free. And so I do think that that's different so I don't anticipate that those public interest obligations would transfer over to television being delivered over the internet.
Well, speaking of decency, that's one of the issues that you've kind of shepherded during your tenure as chairman. Are you satisfied with the results of what you've done?
Oh, I think that it's been important for the Commission to continue to try to enforce our rules and make sure that the programming that's put in by broadcasters, they don't put on programming that's inappropriate for children during hours when children are likely to be watching. I think the Commission has, it's been bipartisan and it's been tough enforcement. But I think it's been almost all of those decisions, I believe, or almost all 5-0 decisions, where all the commissioners participated in supporting us going forward. And I think that's been an important component of what we were doing. Now, I think that obviously some of those enforcement actions are in litigation, but I think you have to put into context that in many ways the actions that we were taking, the Supreme Court case that was argued earlier this year involved, someone during a live broadcast actually uttering two of the words that were on George Carlin's famous monologue years ago about the 7 dirty words you can't say on television or radio, and in many ways that wasn't creating any new words. It was just they were doing some of the same words that had been highlighted and flagged for years by broadcasters as inappropriate. And I also think it's important to put in context that when that decision that was argued before the Supreme Court, the Commission didn't even fine any of the broadcasters that were involved. We just wanted to make sure and clarify that, yeah, this was language that was still inappropriate to be used, and then if it happened again without you implementing an appropriate, the appropriate mechanism to bleep out the words, that would be a potential violation and a fine. And so I think that was an important message to send to the industry.
It's been reported that President-elect Obama is going to appoint Julius Genachowski as the next chairman of the FCC, a Harvard classmate of his. Are you familiar with Mr. Genachowski? Julius Genachowski, I think is a very talented person. I've met him a couple times. He obviously was at the Commission before as a staffer, so he has some institutional knowledge of it, and was a lawyer for Chairman Hunt. I think I was a lawyer for Commissioner Furchtgott Roth before, and I think that brings some important knowledge to coming back to the Commission. So I'm sure he'll, if that's who it is now, like you said, it's just been reported, hasn't been announced. But if that's who it is, I'm sure he'll do a fantastic job. What other qualities do you think an FCC commissioner in 2009 should have?
Well, I certainly think that they need to, be familiar with the underlying technologies and the changes and how rapidly they're occurring. And I think that's one of the things that Julius has already demonstrated that he's very familiar with, and I think that's important. I also think it's important that he have, like I said, some appreciation, understanding of the agency and the institution of the agency, and that, and some of the challenges that we faced in the past, and the framework that we've tried to bring to issues. But I think the most important component for him is that there's got to be a willingness to look at the underlying facts of an issue and make hard decisions. I think, and that doesn't mean necessarily everyone has their own philosophy that they bring. That I've tried to approach. I've tried to approach issues from with a deregulatory philosophy, in which I believe that the market and competition is the best protector of consumer interests, and that whenever possible, you want to make sure that competition is driving prices lower and driving innovation further. But that doesn't mean the government doesn't have a role to play, both in setting a level playing field, as we talked about, and also stepping in where we see that that's not working, and we have to acknowledge. And I think that I have to acknowledge where it doesn't seem to be working by the facts that are in front of me. And I think that being fact-based, not just dogmatic, is a really critical component to making sure that you're being pragmatic in the impact on consumers. And I think that's something that I think is important, and it's probably the most important piece of advice I'd give to somebody coming in.
You spoke about deregulation, but at the American Enterprise Institute recently, you told them that perhaps more regulation is necessary at times.
Oh, but I think that's what I just said as well. I mean, I think I said that I approach the issues with a fundamental belief that a less regulated environment, less government intervention, and more of a reliance on the marketplace is the right approach, and that we should be relying upon competition among the platforms to be delivering the benefits of choice and innovation to consumers. But that you have to recognize the government has a role to play, particularly in these industries that had former incumbents, and making sure it's a level playing field so that we can actually have that competition. And we need to actually look at the underlying facts, and I think this is critical, to see where it seems to be working and where it isn't. And where it's not, look at how we can adjust our regulatory approach to still kind of deliver those underlying benefits to consumers.
How do you stay abreast of all the new technology coming out of Silicon Valley and elsewhere?
Well, I think it's important to get out of Washington, get out of the Beltway, and so, I think both individually and as a group. I've certainly think it's important to go see some of the new technologies that are available, both in traveling either to Silicon Valley, going to the Consumer Electronics Show. I just got back from that this past weekend, and you can see both the changes in technology that are occurring, and you can see actually some of the fruits of some of the decisions that we've made.
So, we'll speak about the fruits of the decisions that you've made.
Oh, I think that one of the exciting things at the most recent Consumer Electronics Show is you're beginning to see the real convergence of televisions that are going to have both the capability of delivering traditional cable video services, but also internet-based video services. And while you're just beginning to see the beginnings of that, and a lot of the televisions had limited internet access capability that they were building in, and they were, I think you're going to see that continue to explode as consumers are going to be able to increasingly be able to go elsewhere for their video. And I think that that's an example of of some of the changes that were a result of some of the policies that we had for the first time enforced. For example, that required the cable operators to use the same underlying technology in a cable card that they were requiring of the independent vendors, the independent manufacturers. And I think that was a part of beginning to open up the cable platform to devices that were manufactured by others, so they could take, if they wanted to, and integrate internet content into it. And I think that's the beginning of seeing some of that.
Well, look 5 years from now and look at some of the decisions that you have made and some of the issues that the FCC will be facing in 5 years. What do you see?
I think that you are going to always continue to see a struggle between trying to provide a regulatory environment that provides an incentive and fosters infrastructure investment, but at the same time make sure that infrastructure isn't being unfairly used to limit where consumers want to go in terms of choices of applications or devices. And this has been a consistent struggle that has always been between the people that have content and or applications devices and the people that own the infrastructure, the pipes. And I think that we've seen that come up several different times, and I think you have to find the right balance, and I assume that this will still be the main issue that will be in front of the Commission in 5 years. But I think that some of the decisions that we've made have been critical in trying to bring about a different approach to that issue, where we've tried to provide a maximum opportunity for people to invest in the underlying infrastructure without it having too burdensome or too many regulations that might discourage people from investing. And at the same time tried to foster a more open environment on the edges of the network to allow for innovation to flow.
Kevin Martin, with the explosion in internet technology and telecommunications technology and the growing sophistication, do you see a need for further regulation beyond just the broadcasters?
Oh, I mean, I think that, as I said before, I think that it's always an important aspect of regulation to make sure that these industries are able to compete on a level playing field, particularly where in the past you've had regulations that have approached different platforms differently. So I think that it is important to make sure that they can compete fairly in the marketplace as they're trying to go get consumers. And I also think that you need to make sure and look at where there seems to be, market failures, so to speak, where we have an underlying social objective that might not be met alone by the marketplace. So, so I think that one of those areas is probably public safety, making sure that that every consumer can pick up any telephone and dial 911 and get the local police and local fire department is something that I think was critical. It's one of the first decisions I made at the Commission, is that regardless of the platform, everyone needed to be able to pick up the phone, call 911, and get the police and fire department, and that the police and fire department ultimately needed to be able to find you back, find you, so they know where you are when you're calling. And I think that's probably an important role for the government to have in terms of regulation that will be there even when there's competition in the marketplace.
What would you advise to a student, a recent grad who's coming into the marketplace looking for a job, who wants to get involved in telecommunications or technology?
Oh, I mean, I think that they have to make sure, first of all, that they have a good understanding of how the technology works, and I think obviously it'd be helpful for them if they did have some kind of an engineering background, or at least were comfortable with engineering issues and technical issues. I think is important, and then they've got to be prepared to be flexible. I mean, the industry has changed, dramatically. In the last 5 years, in the last 10, and even more in the last 10, and even more in the last 15 years. And I think that you have to be prepared to then be changing with it, and that means you're going to be challenged throughout your career to make sure that you're keeping updated on the changes in technology and the implications for the regulatory approach.
And is our education system here in the U.S. keeping up with this?
Oh, I think that, I think that I'm not an education expert, but I certainly think that we need to be doing more to produce people who are comfortable with, with math, science, and engineering. I mean, and I think you hear that in general, but I think you hear that a lot from the technology companies as well, that they want to make sure that people are, have more sophistication in terms of their engineering background to be able to take on some of these complicated issues.
What does a chairman of a company or an engineer in a company in Silicon Valley tell you? What's the best thing Washington can do for them?
I mean, most of the time, a lot of them say want to make sure the government isn't getting in their way and isn't putting anything, isn't in any way burdening them. But there are times when they come forward and say that it's important for Washington to take some steps to make sure that they can actually compete on a level playing field, or they can get access. One of the most, I think one of the most important steps that the Commission has taken in the last few years I was chairman is kind of ushering in a wireless broadband era, but it was also in doing so in a way that really transformed the wireless market and made it much more open to applications. And that was, and we put in place certain restrictions on the largest auction the Commission's ever had, the most successful auction, the 700 megahertz auction, and we put in place a condition that said whoever won the most valuable piece of that had to be open to any kind of device in any application. And we put that condition on because of the complaints and concerns we were hearing from people who were innovating out in Silicon Valley, from handset manufacturers around the world, who were saying that there were artificial barriers and limitations that were being put up in the United States that were limiting innovation. And that was an instance in which they actually did come and say, we need the government to help, and we need to make sure that the people who are owning those pipes or those networks aren't artificially limiting what consumers can do, and that we could provide to them.
Kevin Martin, President-elect Obama has said that he will not appoint lobbyists to be members of his administration. Do you think that's a good thing? There's a lot of experience there, isn't there?
Well, I think there's at times there is, and it is important to have people with experience in the industry and understand that. But I certainly recognize, and I think it is important that people understand the influence that the big industries can end up having in policy making in Washington. So I will leave that up to the new administration to decide how they want to go through that process and how they want to balance those issues related to experience and having the relevant experience and understanding of the industry without also being too captured by them.
What advice would you give to the FCC in dealing with Congress?
Oh, you know, listen, I think it's important to remember that Congress ultimately has to set the policy direction, and that the Commission is trying to implement that. So that they, you know, Congress has the broader view, and I think it's important to work closely with everyone in Congress so that they can, both understand what the Commission is trying to do and see how that fits into their vision. Now, one of the biggest challenges you've got is that because every member of Congress has his own view of what the legislation meant when they passed it. So I have had discussions with the different members of Congress who've all told me, well, you know, I was there when this legislation was passed, and this is what that meant. And of course, someone else said they were there when that legislation was passed, and it meant the exact opposite to them. So the ambiguity in the legislation is the challenge for the Commission. But I think despite that, it's critical to try to work with them as best you can.
And what advice would you give to Congress in dealing with the FCC?
Oh, I think that I would say that they should be clearer whenever they can be in the statutory scheme, and when they're not, then they shouldn't complain so much if people come back and disagree with their interpretation of it. But I think that they should try to be as clear as possible.
Kevin Martin, your term expires 2011?
2011. 2011.
Are you planning on resigning before then?
You know, like I said, I don't have any plans to end up announcing today. You know, the chairmanship is obviously at the discretion of the president, and President-elect, and then President Obama, I'm sure, will nominate or designate one of the two Democratic commissioners to be the interim chairman, and I don't have any other plans to end up announcing today.
Kevin Martin is the current chairman of the FCC. Thanks for being on Communicators.
No, thanks for having me.